The moment that you type dvt in it, dvt created automatically some files and some folders or directories if you're a Mac or Linux. And in this video, I'm going to explain to you what is the purpose of all of those files and folders. Now, if you work locally with DocDB and DBT core, you're going to see two more things. One is your DocDB database, and the other one is the data folder that we created. For now, I'm just going to ignore those. These ones should be the same ones for both DBT Cloud and DBT Core. Let's start. The very first one is going to be analysis. This is essentially a place where you can put SQL scripts that are things that you don't necessarily want to share, but are kind of useful to have around. To me, I know a lot of people don't really use this folder for anything, but I really like it to potentially do data quality checks or some sort of administrative tasks or something that is not purely a test or not purely something that I want to share with the end stakeholders. So a place for SQL files that you don't want to expose to stakeholders. I generally use it for data quality reports. More than tests, is reports. Like if I want to see how bad a data quality thing is, I generally just type my SQL script and it lives there. But again, maybe lots of people don't use it, so that's fully fine. The second thing is gonna be the dvt project.yaml. This is a file, and I would dare to say that this is the most important file in dvt. The reason for that is from here you can tell dvt what's the name of your project, what is the name of your profile. It has some space for you to set up some defaults, save some variables. It might not seem that crazy, but just know that every single time you do a dvt command, what actually happens is dvt checks if it finds this dvt projects.yaml, which I just opened it, it looks like this. And if it's not present, it's automatically gonna fail. So one, it is very important to have this file. Two, it is very important that these names, especially this one right here, matches your profile. And it has also some nice tricks like default materializations and variables, which we're going to explain in a later video. Tells dvt some defaults. You needed to run dvt commands. For dvt core, your profile should match the one in the document, in the .dvt profiles.yaml. Let's go to the next one. Let's talk about dvt macros. Now macros, every single time that you want to either encapsulate a piece of logic, like a piece of code, or if you find yourself repeating the same amount of SQL in multiple places, dvt has a feature that is very similar to a UDF, a user-defined function, or maybe even more to a Python function. So they behave like Python functions, reusable logic. They can much easily be tested. Every time that you have something that might potentially change, like a definition, it's very nice to always put it in a macro. So if you indeed need to change something, you can just do it in the macro and nowhere else. Some examples of things that people generally do with macros is conversions. So for example, you need to convert normal calendar to the fiscal calendar of your own company, you might want to do that as a macro, so that if your company ever changes the way that that works, you can just simply, you know exactly that it's there in the macro. Things like tax rates. If you're working with variable norms or tax breaks, so for this category, we go with the tax rate. Things like that, you can either do it as a table. Some people do it as a table, but you could also do it as a macro. And then that way, if a definition changes or if you need to reuse that, it's not like a code snippet that you need to have in multiple files. So they help you encapsulate logic in one place. They can be tested. Yeah, okay, everything can be tested, but it's just nice because like testing a macro is like testing a little chunk instead of testing something else. Now models, this one is probably the largest one, so I'm gonna move it to the end just because it's the one that we're gonna talk to about the most. The readme.markdown, this is just simply the documentation of your project. Some people place installation setup guides here. Some people put here contact information. Essentially, this is the first thing people are gonna see about your project. Now, by default, DBT creates this. So it's just some resources like the Slack community. But I think most companies just generally modify this to whatever they need. Probably the thing that makes me the happiest is information on how to run a project. Like, do I need a credential from somebody? Do I need to be onboarded somehow? All of that is really nice to put it there. Next directory is gonna be the seeds. Now, seeds is a feature of DBT. Not everybody uses it. It is considered maybe more of a quick and dirty, but imagine that you are in a situation where you need to ingest some data into the database, but for whatever reason, you either are not fully ready to create a table or you don't have the right permissions, or you know that it's going to change a lot and you want to like experiment and you prefer to upload it as a CSV for whatever interesting reason. If that's the case, then use a seed. It's a place where you upload flat files and you can ingest them as DBT models inside of your database. Once again, a bit of a quick and dirty. You probably want to come up with a more permanent solution, just like fixing something directly into a database. But things like lookup tables or a little test that you might want to try, they're really nice. A space to upload CSVs and flat files, to add them to DBT later. Quick and dirty approach. Better to fix at source. So think about it as if you have the option, don't use it. But you might be in a situation where, for whatever reason, you don't have control over the database, you don't have the right permissions, you need to test something, or you just want to show it to a stakeholder, hey, is this correct, before I fully upload it, then Seeds is perfect, and it's nice that it exists. Next one is going to be snapshots. Now, if you ever find yourself in the situation where you have a table, that table has a column that overwrites itself, but you really want to keep the history. I'll give you an example. In my first job, we had a table called orders, and there was a column called current status. Current status was always overwritten, and nowhere else in the database we kept history of when would things change. So when did the client went from sales inquiry to paid to delivered to returned. We only had the last status. And this worked for operational purposes, but for analytical purposes, it was sad because we wanted to know how long did it take for something to be delivered, or what percentage of people cancel after being so long in this step. And we didn't have it. What Snapshot does is it takes think of it as a picture of a table at a certain moment in time. So in my example of the statuses, every time that you run a snapshot, it would say the table right now in this timestamp has this value. And if that changes the next time that you run a snapshot, you're gonna get another row saying, hey, now this is the new value, without completely overwriting it. So it's nice because it helps you keep a history of a table. Once again, this is not something you want to solve with DBT, but rather you really want to do it at the source. But if for whatever reason it's not in your control, snapshots work quite well. So take sure, let's call it take it a picture to avoid saying snapshot of a table at a moment in time. Useful to track the history of a column that overwrites itself. Two more to go. The next one is gonna be tests. And this one is, there are many ways to test your work in DBT. But what this particular directory does, it is a place where you can put SQL files that work as assertions. So essentially you put a SQL file. If that query returns more than 0 rows, then your DBT project is gonna fail. So a place to put assertions in SQL format. I'll give you an example. I had a client that had some vehicles, and in my DBT logic, those vehicles should always be accounted for 24 hours of every single day. Even if the vehicle was just parked, or if it was moving or something like that, we had to make sure that the timestamps always cover the 24 hours of the day. And so we wrote a test that says, hey, the amount of hours per day has to be exactly 24. And believe it or not, sometimes we would mess up our logic. Sometimes we would filter some data out accidentally, and the data would be like 23, 22 or something like that. And it would say, hey, there is an error here. And that was a massive time saver, because at least a handful of times something in the logic broke, like we accidentally filtered too much or we did a join wrong. And having assertions tested there was a real saver. So it's not the only way to test your DBT data, but it's just one of them. They used to call that type of test a singular test. So a place for singular tests. If this SQL command returns more than 0 rows, the DBT run fails. Or well, actually the DBT build. We're gonna talk more about build, test, and so on in a moment. And finally, we have the models, which is probably the most important directory. Here is where we put our SQL logic, or actually they do support Python logic, but that's not something I've used too much. So I might just refer it as models. Generally here, this is where they ask you to put all of your logic. They generally suggest you to break it into 3 steps. So DBT suggests 3 subfolders. They suggest you to have staging, ingestion, intermediate, and Marts. So staging is the place where you're gonna put all of your SQL sources. So raw table from database. This is where you would add some files, and I'm gonna show you that in the next video, saying, hey, all of the data I want to work with currently lives in the database in this particular location. And additionally, you also have staging files, which are one-to-one copy of your data with minimal cleaning steps. So essentially, not for heavy duty cleaning, but things like data types or renaming columns, or maybe even things like filter some rows that are clearly empty, remove some columns that are not needed, or maybe even like standardize some values in the table. Now, I do recommend that keep it one-to-one, so same number of rows, same number of columns as your raw data. But sometimes it's convenient to break the laws here. So essentially, those are the two things that you would put inside of the staging directory. Intermediate, being honest with you, it's a lot easier to explain Marts first and then the purpose of intermediate. So Marts here is where all of the data that you're going to expose to your end users live. If it is in Marts, it is ready for consumption. In an ideal universe, and if you have your DBT project and your governance set up really well, you should only expose the tables that live inside of Marts, and every other thing like staging and intermediate, no BI tool, no analyst, no business stakeholders should have access to anything in there. Except maybe like the raw data if they want to compare, but essentially the Marts is the place where everything that is ready for consumption. Generally, you would put here tables ready for dashboards, or properly modeled clean tables. Quite often star schemas, but it doesn't have to be. It's just whatever it is that people want to consume. And finally, there is intermediate, which, as you can already imagine, is anything that is in between these two. It's not quite the raw data, but it's also not quite something you want to expose to stakeholders at the end. So very complicated joins, data quality, standardization, or cleaning processes, they go there. But by definition, it's more like anything that doesn't fit the two categories, you should put it in there. So anything that is not raw nor you want to expose. No guidelines, just nice for heavy duty cleaning or complex logic. These are the ways that DBT suggests you to put your models. Models, once again, are just SQL files. But of course, this is just guidelines. I've seen some organization breaking these ones. I've seen people working with the exact names of the medallion architecture. I've seen people going for bronze, silver, gold. I've seen people going for many steps, or first, second, third, and last. I've seen a lot of crazy conventions. Just if you don't know, if you don't have any better idea, or if there is not something that you work in your organization, I recommend you that inside of your models, you keep these exact same conventions. In this course, we are going to use staging, intermediate, and marks as conventions just to follow DBT best practices. I hope this explained the purpose of a DBT project. In the next videos, we're actually going to start putting SQL files in here. See you in the next one.